Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In case you're new here, my name is Laura and I'm a PhD student of Comparative Literature in Germany. And this is my series on Gothic and Romantic literature. Today we are delving into the origins of Gothic fiction in the 18th century, beginning with the novel The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, published in 1764. But I will talk about this novel in detail in another video. This video is going to mention the key characteristics of Gothic literature. I will explain a little bit about the historical and literary background and also explain the concept of the sublime and the difference between Gothic terror and horror. I hope you enjoy it. Next, I will talk about the key characteristics of Gothic fiction. First, you have to know that the term Gothic simply meant antique and barbarous, with a reference to the architecture that the Gothic literature was inspired by in the 18th century, so the medieval castles and ruins as well. As I said, the literature emerged in the late 18th century, and it is characterized by a set of distinctive themes, settings, and motifs. And they were foundational in shaping the atmosphere of mystery, fear, and the supernatural. So I will mention some of these key features so that you get more of an impression of what makes Gothic literature special. The first one is that most novels are set in a medieval or exotic setting. Like when the novel was written by a British person, oftentimes they were setting the novels, for example, in Italy or in Spain or somewhere more in the south of Europe. And they were also choosing castles or ancient ruins or monasteries as the setting to create a rather eerie atmosphere in their novels. So they often take place in these ancient or medieval settings, and also oftentimes in isolated settings, which also create an atmosphere of suspense. And the key characteristic that I want to mention next is the supernatural, which is closely connected to this eerie atmosphere as well. So things such as ghosts or whispers that people tend to hear, and the feeling that there's some supernatural things going on, things you cannot explain, that you hear when you're walking the staircase or the hallway of a medieval castle, for example. These eerie elements that you cannot quite grasp, they are definitely a very distinctive feature of Gothic literature as well. And they are often also introduced into the novels to create this atmosphere in which the reader also doesn't really know what is actually happening and whether things are true or false, or whether it's just happening in the imagination of the characters or rather in the imagination of the reader even. So, as I mentioned before, this atmosphere of mystery and suspense is also quite a distinctive feature, and also that the focus is more on the inner world of the character, so it is not so much anymore about the outer world and events that happen in the world, but it's rather about the inner world of the people and psychological questions, emotions, and things that happen to the people and inside the people especially. And the emotional extremity that is also expressed through these feelings creates quite an extreme tension as well in the novels, and this way you can also create tension in the narrative sometimes. Then you also have themes of isolation and entrapment. So characters are oftentimes physically trapped in castles, in labyrinths and dungeons, or they are mentally confined by fear, guilt, or even madness. And this sense of entrapment intensifies the feelings of terror. Then you also have a quite distinctive feature, that is that the past often influences the present, for example by ancient secrets or family curses that still haunt the characters till the present. So family secrets are things that just emerged from the past that people brought into their lives and that really haunt them later on. That is a very distinctive feature as well, and also used to create more suspense. And another key feature is the exploration of the sublime, which I will explain in more detail a little later. It is basically used to create a sense of awe and fear, and also the expectation and anticipation of these feelings, which is quite new in the writings of the Gothic fiction. And one last theme I wanted to mention is death and decay, which is oftentimes found in Gothic fiction. So themes of mortality, decay, and the fear of death are central to early Gothic fiction. Death oftentimes appears in the forms of haunted places, dead relatives returning to influence the living, as I said before, or just really a fixation on the macabre. And I want to mention three key examples of these things. The first one is Horace Walpole's novel The Castle of Otranto by 1764, which is considered the first Gothic novel, and it includes many of these early elements, such as an old castle, a family curse, and supernatural events. Then you have Anne Radcliffe's novel The Mysteries of Udolpho from 1794, which focuses on a psychological horror with heroines facing the unknown within dark, ruined castles, and are often under the threat of a sinister male figure. And the third example I want to bring is The Monk, written by Matthew Lewis and published in 1796, which explores the darker side of Gothic fiction with explicit horror, sexual transgression, and moral corruption. So these are just three examples of the rather early Gothic fiction published in the late 18th century. So these features laid the foundation for later Gothic works and influenced the development of horror and dark romanticism into the 19th and even the 20th century. So I hope you could get an impression of these characteristic features now. So to introduce you to the literary and historical background of the emergence of Gothic literature in England, I will basically draw upon the essay The Genesis of Gothic Fiction by E.J. Clery, published in the Cambridge Companion to Gothic Fiction, which I found to be very delightful and interesting. So I can definitely recommend it, and I will also link it below. Please excuse if I just quote directly, because I think it's just difficult to summarize it better in my own words, and therefore I will just go through some short passages that I found to be most strikingly interesting. So what E.J. Clery starts with in her essay is that she says the attachment of the term Gothic to the literature of terror is quite a recent development, and it's just actually happening more and more in the 20th century, because before it was intended to be called like with Horace Walpole, a Gothic story, but other than that there was no really clear idea what the Gothic even meant at the time. So for the background of Horace Walpole's writing of the first Gothic story, you have to know that the Gothic age was, like, for a long period considered as a period of barbarism, superstition, and anarchy, and Gothic also signified anything obsolete, old-fashioned, or outlandish to the people. She says here, quote, "Otranto may have been set in Gothic times, but the term does nothing to describe what was groundbreaking and influential about the novel, and Walpole does not use it again in his preface to the second edition, which constitutes a manifesto for a new species of romance." And after Otranto, the only significant work in which the term Gothic appears is in a subtitle of Clara Reeves' The Old English Baron. So that's interesting to see that over quite a long period of time, no other story was called Gothic as a genre marker or anything in the subtitles. Therefore, E.G. Clery says that the Gothic novel is mostly a 20th century coinage. That's interesting to know, I think. It was justified to call it Gothic because it was an analogy with the Gothic revival in architecture, which happened at the same time in the 18th century. And it also
like it rose at the same time, you know. Also like the mid 18th century was when the Gothic revival in architecture happened and the neo-Gothic cathedrals were built, and at the same time or a little later then also Horace Walpole was writing the Castle of Otranto, and he was even inspired by his own castle that he has built called Strawberry Hill House. And the interesting thing is that in the time when the Castle of Otranto was published, Walpole really tried to challenge the existing kind of novel writing, because he says that modern fiction is too probable, although romances had been called improbable by literary critics. So the Castle of Otranto can be seen as one of various attempts around the time to cut a new path in literature by looking back to the past. And the poets William Collins, Edward Young, Walpole's friend Thomas Gray, and the fabricator of Ossian, James Macpherson, were all important innovators of this kind. Horace Walpole and other writers at the time were mainly inspired by the so-called concept of the sublime, which was like referring back to a classical text called On the Sublime, or in ancient Greek Perihoupsos, which is attributed to Longinus. And this was first translated into French in 1674 and then also later into English. And it was just really used to challenge the classical concepts of writing or literature in general, which is mostly, or most notably, mimesis, the concept of the imitation of nature and trying to imitate nature as best as possible. And the inclusion of supernatural or fantastical elements was something quite new that came with this Gothic genre. And the most important text in this regard is in 1757, when Edmund Burke published his philosophical enquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful. It was the most ambitious and methodical consideration of the sublime yet published, and it presented imaginative transport not only as desirable, one rhetoric option among others, but as a necessity mentally and even physiologically. Burke begins by outlining the problem of indifference, a state of mental lethargy brought about by a steady diet of the familiar. Positive pleasure, the type of novelty associated with beauty, is one way of relieving the problem, but it is only a mild and temporary cure. Far more effective is a peculiar kind of pain mixed with delight, the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. And here he refers to the sublime. So Burke also says that the sublime is the state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror, and the mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other. And just as the muscles of the body must be kept in tone, so the imagination must be shaken and worked to a proper degree by images and ideas of the terrible sublime. So you see this very new idea that the imagination has to be addressed directly by the writer. So that's quite interesting. I will talk a little bit more about the concept of the sublime in relation to the difference between Gothic terror and horror in a second, but first I want to read another passage from this wonderful essay by E.J. Clery, because I think she draws attention to an aspect that's oftentimes overlooked. So just please listen closely. The return of romance to 18th century fiction needs to be seen in economic context as a symptom of the vicissitudes of the publishing industry and a response to the search for novelty. As a consequence of Ian Watt's landmark study, we are accustomed to the idea of the rise of the novel and the corollary that is never looked back. Works such as Samuel Richardson's Pamela and Clarissa, Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Julie ou La Nouvelle Héloïse were not only huge publishing successes but media events that launched numerous spin-offs such as journalistic responses, spoofs, theatrical adaptations, print engravings and sermons, as well as a host of imitators. But by the 1770s, the lack of new and original contenders was sending the novel into what appeared to be a terminal decline. Between 1776 and 1779, an average of 17 new novels per year were published, a slump from a high of 60 in 1771. There were no doubt various factors at play, including the contingencies of war in the American colonies and changes in copyright law, but it seems likely that the generic exhaustion was much of the problem. For years, would-be heirs to Richardson and Sterne had been churning out feeble imitations, e.g. Clery says here. The reading public were beginning to tire of these, and publishers and booksellers were becoming discouraged. But it was also precisely at the point that Clara Reeve decided to take up Walpole's challenge to develop a new route in fiction and wrote The Old English Baron. So I think it's quite interesting to see that there's something new emerging here that has not been there before, especially speaking to the imagination and using these supernatural elements that just give the writer a lot of space to just play around and just find new narrative techniques and new ways of telling exciting and also terrifying stories.
So one other aspect I wanted to talk about is the difference between Gothic terror and Gothic horror, because you might have heard both of these terms and wondered what makes the difference. So that's why I brought a quote by Anne Radcliffe, who has been writing quite a lot of popular novels in the early Gothic fiction genre, but she's also been working academically. So this quote is from her essay on the supernatural in poetry, and it says the following: "Terror and horror are so far opposite that the first expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of life. The other contracts, freezes and nearly annihilates them. I apprehend that neither Shakespeare nor Milton by their fictions, nor Mr. Burke by his reasoning, anywhere looked to positive horror as a source of the sublime, though they all agree that terror is a very high one, and where lies the great difference between horror and terror, but in the uncertainty and obscurity that accompany the first, respecting the dreaded evil." So, as you can see from this quote, there is quite a difference between Gothic terror and Gothic horror, because Gothic horror is something you can grasp very easily and describe, while Gothic terror is that which evokes the sublime and which is more eerie, more creepy and more difficult to grasp. So terror focuses on anticipation and dread of something fearful or unknown without directly confronting it, and the effect is that it increases an emotional, psychological tension playing on the imagination of the audience or of the readership, and the fear is often vague or suggested, leading to unease and suspense rather than outright shock. Key features are ambiguity, mystery and the unseen, and there is a sense of foreboding, but the frightening element is often implied rather than fully shown. One example could be the ominous setting of a dark, crumbling castle or the sound of eerie footsteps in the distance without showing the source. So you cannot really grasp, you cannot quite grasp what's going on, but you feel this terror, you feel this fright and this emotion, this anticipation of something bad happening. And then you also have Gothic horror, which has an emphasis on the actual confrontation with the terrifying or monstrous, where fear is more direct and visceral. So the effect is that it seeks to shock or repulse the audience by presenting graphic or grotesque elements and evokes a reaction of fear, disgust or physical revulsion. Key features are the focus on the explicit, with clear depiction of the horrifying elements such as violence, decay or supernatural encounters. One example could be the very physical appearance of a ghost or a gruesome murder scene shown in detail, so something that you cannot escape because it's happening right in front of you. So in short, terror deals with the fear of the unknown and unseen, creating suspense, while horror confronts the audience with the terrifying reality, invoking shock and disgust. Both are important to Gothic fiction, but serve different purposes in evoking fear. So this was my video on the origins of Gothic fiction in the 18th century, and I hope I could give you some of the historical and literary background and tell you a little bit more about how this genre is like distinct from others and why it became so popular as well.
So I hope that through this video you could get a little bit of an impression of what Gothic fiction was like in the very beginning and how it emerged and why it was popular or not popular and how it changed over time. And I think I will make more videos on the historical and literary context of Gothic fiction in the future. I would like to put a focus on other countries as well, so not just this very Anglophone view, but rather also looking at how did Gothic literature emerge in other countries such as Germany, France, Italy, or even some other places. And I will definitely also make more videos on specific works. So the next video on Gothic literature will be a video on the Castle of Otranto and its presentation to the public, how it was conceived by the public and by literary critics as the first Gothic story and how it was presented and innovated by Horace Walpole. So if you're interested in that, please stay tuned for the video. And I will also make videos on other Gothic stories in the future, so please stay tuned for that.
If you haven't yet, consider subscribing to my channel if you want to. I really appreciate if you enjoy the videos and just follow me so that I can actually see that you enjoy them. So yeah, please consider subscribing, and otherwise I hope I will see you in my next video. Thank you and bye bye.